Welcome again. We're back for the second segment of the study in the Old Testament. Last week we did kind of an introduction to the Old Testament, and this week we'll begin to address an introduction to one particular part. That's the first section of the Old Testament, called the Pentateuch or the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So we'll begin with this, James. As we're addressing these first 5 books, who wrote them? Was it one person or several people? And what are the thoughts on that in general, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, already we dive into controversy. Of course, anytime you talk about the Bible, you're going to run into controversy. But traditionally, the Jews viewed these books as having been actually dictated by God to Moses. I don't know that you have to believe that there's anything in the Scripture that compels us to believe that. But I do think that the idea that they were written by Moses at some point before he died, at least all but the last few verses of Deuteronomy, I think there's a compelling argument to be made for that, in the New Testament, Jesus refers to these books as the books of Moses, and he constantly quotes them and says, Moses said to you. And the same is true of people in Palestine that he's discussing these things with, and the other New Testament writers. Something can be said, there's some good arguments that have been made by modern textual criticism in the last 150 years. There's been several theories put forward, and I think that they're worth investigating. But I lean toward the traditional view. Like I said, if I'm going to err, I'm going to err with Jesus.
That's a pretty good thing to err. Yeah. Okay. Well, so along that same line then, because this is a question that we're getting even deeper into controversy here. People will ask, can we trust that the things in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis and Exodus, that they actually happened? I mean, there's all kinds of controversy, modern controversy, that centers around these things, and you don't have to dive deep into any one of these subjects, but just kind of address the reliability of it. Like, for instance, evolution, or a 6-day creation, or a worldwide flood. Can we trust that the way that it's written in Genesis, Exodus, can we trust that those things actually happened?
Well, first of all, let me say that all Christians agree that the theological significance of what is being taught in these books is absolutely the most important, and that ancient people told things in a theological way. On that we agree. I think we can trust that the things in Genesis and Exodus actually happened because, well, for example, Jesus refers to Adam and Eve as literal persons, historical figures. He refers to Noah in the same way as in the days of Noah, he says, so shall it be before the Son of Man comes. And so, Jesus had every opportunity in the world to correct the bad thinking, the poor theology of the people of his day. In fact, he takes a lot of time in his ministry actually correcting the bad teaching of the people in his day. But if Jesus somehow, if this were not true, that these were historical figures, Jesus certainly appears to have believed that they were.
Okay.
And so because he refers to them as literal people, and he refers to the events as historical events, I think it's significant. I think we need to also. I'm concerned with if we do not have a literal Adam, then historic Christianity, the Christianity of the apostles of the first century, it falls. You can throw out Paul's arguments in Romans. Paul didn't know what he was talking about. We have a serious issue with Christianity in general. I realize you can have something that you call Christianity, but it's not the apostolic faith. It's something that's different.
Right.
And I'm concerned that we maintain the apostolic faith. When we worship together, when we're in communion on Communion Sunday, in some sense, we're in communion with all the saints of all time in Christ. there in our midst, and we believe the same things. We have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and that unity is essential. And if in 21st century Western culture, all of a sudden we have something we call Christianity that is different from the faith of the apostles, well, we don't have Christianity. And so, yes, I do believe that we can trust that the things that in Genesis and Exodus actually happened, because I think that Jesus taught that they did.
I think it's important to bring up, I agree with you, but I also think it's important to bring up that within the realm of Christianity, I think that there are some points, like you point out about Adam, where there's a lot pinned on it and a lot hinges on it. But there are also some other points where we could maybe debate and disagree a little bit more about. For instance, was the flood actually worldwide or was it regional, in the story of Noah? And I think those are things where good arguments can be made either way. You could fall down either way, but it's not necessarily anything that Christians have to divide over on those particular issues. Would you say that there are some non-essential points?
I don't think that anyone's faith or eternal destiny hinges on
Whether the flood was worldwide?
what they believe about the flood, yes.
Okay.
And I do think that there is definitely a place for good, honest, straightforward, loving discussion of these things. Proverbs says, buy the truth and sell it not. So, truth is important.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why Christians argue a lot.
Yeah.
Because they have a high view of truth. And so, there is a place for these discussions. There's a place at the table for people of differing viewpoints on this. And like I said, my concern is the historic faith. That we don't get to the point where we have questioned so much that we have, in essence, abandoned the historic faith.
Okay. So there's room for, there's lots of room for thinking in the midst of the Old Testament, you'd say.
Yes.
Okay, good.
And we're called to think.
Sure.
We're called to question. In some churches, you're kind of discouraged to question or to ask questions. I think that's a mistake. We're confronted by a culture of unbelief. We're confronted by a culture that has been seriously affected by the modernism of the 19th century in the way that we think and we view things. And let's be honest, there's a lot of people who don't want anything to do with Genesis and Exodus because there are miracles recounted. And that just, it's ironic that the things that God does in ancient times to prove himself to the people are the very things that modern people look back on and say, those are the reasons why we don't believe. Isn't that ironic?
Ironic indeed. Yeah. Okay, next question. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are called Torah, and often, especially as they come out of the Jewish tradition, Torah becomes synonymous with law. It's called they will say Torah, and sometimes they'll refer to it simply as law. But there are lots of portions in those first 5 books that are not necessarily legal writings. I mean, they're narrative portions. So how do we reconcile that? Is it law or is it narrative? In what sense can narrative be law, or is it?
There are different genres represented within these books. The word Torah, if I'm not mistaken, just in the Hebrew just means teaching or instruction. In general, I think at one time, in some instances, depending on context, Torah can actually refer, or has been used to refer to all of the Old Testament, the law. But in a specific sense, it's just the Torah of Moses, or the Torah, the instruction given to Moses by God. And so it's just an instruction or teaching. The Hebrew people, the people being brought out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, needed to know who they were, where they were from, who God was, why he was bringing them out of Egypt, and what he planned to do with them in the future. And that's what the 5 books of Moses tell. They tell that story to those people. But they also, of course, do something a little more important than that, I think, for us. Because they're also important to us in that they point forward to Christ
Okay,
from the Christian perspective.
I agree. Okay, here's a question that many people who are either new to the faith or trying to read through the Bible for the first time, for right or wrong, many people will begin at the beginning. They'll begin at Genesis. And they'll start reading through the Bible, and they'll get through Genesis. It's got a lot of cool stories in it. They'll get through the first part of Exodus. That's got the stories, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the Ten Commandments, all the cool stories of Exodus. But then you get through toward the end of Exodus, and maybe you make it through, but it starts to get a little brutal because it's just the recounting of how to build some very specific things. And then you think, well, maybe it'll pick up, and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and for many people it doesn't pick up. They don't feel, it just continues to be this boring books, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Right.
What do you say to that? And if that's not the case, if you don't think that, if God doesn't want these to be boring for us, or what can be compelling for the Christian to read through the rest of the 5 books?
Well, first of all, I feel your pain. I remember when I was in my early teens and wanting to read through the entire Bible, and I must have read through Genesis and got bogged down in Exodus 2 or 3 times before I finally remembered finishing the book of Exodus, and it was almost one of those yes moments when I could say that I had finished Exodus. And let's be honest, there's parts of the Bible that are boring. I know it's not necessarily, I don't know if the word is politically correct to say that, but let's be honest about it. There's nothing interesting about the genealogies. There's nothing interesting about a chapter with 70 or 80 verses that is nothing but a description of what this son of this person brought forward, and an offering of this many shekels of gold. And then after he's finished, it's the exact same description with a different name. And we go through, and you realize that when you come to the third name, that there's going to be 12, because there's a person representing each of the tribes who's done this, and you go, oh my goodness, am I going to get through this chapter? I've got it. It's going to say, it's going to have 5 verses that say the same thing again. And then there's, John alluded to, the descriptions of how exactly to build the tabernacle, and how exactly to do the offerings, and how the priestly garments are to be. And all of these things, understand that all of these things are important. They were important in their place. They are not all equally applicable to our lives. And so as far as relevance, they're all equally important. They do not all have equal relevance to us today.
Okay.
And I would also say, I was sharing with John a meme I saw earlier that said something to the effect of, "Suck it up, princess." I would also say that we're kind of spoiled in that we live in a very entertainment-oriented generation. And it's almost as if it's not entertaining enough for us, then it's not worth giving our time for. And I would suggest to you that even the portions that are boring and not entertaining are worth giving your time to.
Okay.
But be of good cheer. It's not all bad.
It's not.
Okay, for example, even after chapter 20 in Exodus, when it goes into some long, boring chapters, it's interspersed with some events that take place. I think there's 2 or 3 chapters where Moses comes down from the mountain and sees that the people have gone into idolatry, and they've made them golden calves, or they threw the gold in the fire, and he said, "Look, these be the calves. This be the God that brought you out of Israel." Moses gets angry, and he melts down the calf, the gold, and makes them drink it from the water.